Hey everyone, how's it going? Welcome to Hour of History, our world anytime, any place. We've got a new episode for you this week in a new format, new style, and a break from the typical interview. You're going to want to stick around for this, and as always, check out hourofhistory.com for some excellent recommendations, 49 other fantastic episodes, and some informative blog posts at hourofhistory.com/blog. This episode is brought to you by Namecheap. For domain names, it's easy for me to say, for domain names starting at 88 cents, that's less than $1, head over to hourofhistory.com/namecheap to register your domain name today. Namecheap makes it easy for you to search for and register your domain, and as if that's not enough, we'll throw in the free WhoisGuard privacy protection, so you can keep your private data hidden from the public Whois database, and 2 free months of private email to manage the new email addresses you set up. So whether you're starting up a podcast or a website to promote the excellent work that I'm sure you all are doing, or just a hobby, it doesn't always have to be work, make sure you head over to hourofhistory.com/namecheap. That way you can support the show and get your own domain. So what do we have for you today? Hour of History has been bringing to you now for 50 episodes excellent interviews and a variety of topics that have covered our whole world from the past, from very far, from medieval times to the present day. And interspersed in there, there's also been the Cities podcast, which was a short divergence to various cities around the world that will most likely be coming up soon. Now, my idea for this segment is, rather than have an interview, to take you around the world for some significant events and just give some historical background to things that are happening in our world. This last week was rather significant, and it offered an opportunity for reflection and for historical thought on things that are occurring in our world and changing the way that people talk about what's going on in the present day. So this segment is called What in the World because it's talking about current events, history, and all the things that make you love the show. So with that said, look forward to this segment coming every few weeks as we add more variety to the Hour of History show. We'll continue those great interviews next week and through the rest of the year. So thanks again for listening, and thanks for subscribing. Here we go with What in the World.
This is the Hour of History podcast. Our world, anytime, any place. And now from the Hour of History studio in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, your Hour of History starts right now.
So first off, on November 9th and 10th, just a week ago, marked the anniversary of 80 years since Kristallnacht. Kristallnacht was an event in 1938 Germany, by then a one-party Nazi state, in which uprisings throughout the state led to mass destruction of synagogues and homes and Jewish businesses, while most of the authorities just watched on and did not respond. It's significant not only because the year ends in 0 and we like to commemorate years that end in tens because we love the decimal system, but it's also significant because of the way that crimes sort of go unpunished and the world watched. It wasn't as if the world didn't know what was happening in Nazi Germany. In fact, for many years the world had known exactly what was happening. Earlier in 1938, on the 6th of July, a bunch of nations met in Evian, France, to discuss precisely what to do with the Jewish population of Germany. One of Hitler's ploys was to challenge the world to see if they would take the very Jews that he was using as scapegoats for the failures of the Weimar Republic, and no one responded. the Avion Conference, a conference that was designed to help solve the refugee problem that brought governments together from the United States and Europe and across the world, resulted in little more than empty promises. Famously, Rafael Trujillo of the Dominican Republic was one of the few people who promised, and he promised great numbers of refugees. He said they could all come to the Dominican Republic, which ironically enough was part of Trujillo's program to whiten the Dominican Republic, because he perceived he perceived this as a chance to make his population less black. But even Trujillo's offers are never fulfilled. He talks big numbers, saying millions of Jews can come to the Dominican Republic, and it doesn't work. From the United States, there was never any mystery of what was going to happen at the conference. While it wasn't attended by the President Franklin Roosevelt, he did send an envoy with strict instructions not to make promises for the United States. While the United States had plenty of land and plenty of space and plenty of opportunities for Jewish immigration, especially from Central Europe, people were starting to espouse this sentiment of nativist nationalism. People in the United States didn't want non-Americans to be in the United States, and there were many reasons for that. Most of them shockingly similar to the sort of things that we hear today. And fear was almost one of the most common threads in this anti-Jewish immigration idea. So the Avion Conference had failed on the 6th of July, and this sort of, every time these things failed, and there had been big accidents like the sailing of the MS St. Louis even before, where anytime these accidents happened, the Nazi regime had more propaganda to spread about the Jews being unwanted anywhere in the world. And when you read the documentation of Kristallnacht, it is shocking how neighborly the violence was. There's one family I've researched while at the United States Holocaust Museum who ran a small business, a small shop in their hometown, which they had lived for 30 or 40 years. The grandfather of the family and the father of the family had both fought for Germany in World War I in one manner or another. They were both proud of their German citizenship, of being Germans. In fact, the son, who eventually became a refugee himself, wrote about how crushed his father was seeing the sort of attacks that were done on Jews from beginning in the 1930s, the language that would appear in the German news. The family wasn't particularly religious. The grandfather would go to synagogue. It was sort of an activity for him in retirement. It was where he found some community. The father spent most of his time in his business, working in his shop, and the two sons were part of the community school. In the middle 1930s, they noticed things starting to go wrong in class when people would use language and symbols and gestures that were meant to show fear and were meant to make this group scared of what was happening in the world. Now, as time continued for these people, they saw things get worse and worse, and it all culminated in that night, in November 9th, November 10th, 1938, where the synagogue they attended was set on fire, the business of the fathers was destroyed, and their house as well was set on fire. So this family lost nearly all of its possessions, all of its community, and people who had once been neighbors simply attacked or failed to stand up for their neighbors. So people who had perhaps never done anything in the past, never shown any violent action, but had sort of gone along with what was happening in Germany at the time, didn't stand up for them. And the result was this terrible disaster. And the disaster didn't sort of end the problems. The authorities looked the other way, and it really became a race to escape Germany at that point. And those who could leave left, and those who couldn't leave were unable to. And especially those who were older, who had lived in Germany their entire life, were unable to. And for them, most of them ended up dead, murdered in the Holocaust. So it's important to remember these sort of things. It's important to remember that someone who could be a decorated war veteran in a society only 10 years before 1938 could be having his business burned down, his synagogue burned down, and his family forced out of a home, of a city, of a nation that they had lived in for many years. We think that these things are impossible. These kind of things are far off and they're in the past and their history. But the reality is that events can change rather quickly, and it's important that we stand up when we see things going wrong. So 80 years since Kristallnacht. Now, that was on the 9th and 10th. On the 11th, we had another important commemoration. That was 100 years since the end of World War I. So, on the 11th minute of the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, peace was signed, and after 4 years of fighting, World War I was brought to a close. This is another one of those interesting sort of commemorations we have where 100 years seems to be significant for whatever reason. We like the decimal system and the nice round numbers, and we've finally reached 100 years since this terrible tragedy ended. Now, there have been a lot of commemorations going on since 2014, leading up to this sort of 100th year anniversary, 100-year end. It's likely that you've seen the pictures of political leaders in various European locations commemorating these events. What I want to talk about here, and I encourage you to also check out my technology episode where I interview Andrea Ciotto, who studies World War I, for further information on World War I. But what I want to talk about in terms of the 100 years since the end of World War I is a couple things. Number one, the potential that was seen at the end of World War I, the idea that after such a terrible, violent conflict, people would come together. And number two, the idea that World War I was the war to end all wars. So first, the potential of World War I. World War I, when it ended, there was an idea that new sort of world order was going to come into effect. Woodrow Wilson and the League of Nations are sort of like this classic example of the world is going to talk about things before going into a hellscape chaos like it did just 4 years ago. But there's a lot of problems with this, almost starting immediately. But we don't need to get into the problems. Staying positive, the idea that countries would come together before attacking each other is sort of a revolutionary one, and one that kind of changes the next 100 years. Certainly the League of Nations fails, but we see it as sort of a predecessor to the United Nations. The Kellogg-Briand Pact happens years later, which essentially outlaws war from a legal standpoint. And even though nations and armies continue to get around these laws, it is a starting point for a conversation towards peace. It sounds sort of like a Pyrrhic victory at this point, but 100 years on, things and wars are in a lot of ways more separated, at least from civilians. Now, when the war ended, there's also an idea that was put forth of sovereignty, of nations being able to choose their own destiny. Now, this idea is most embodied in the move towards self-determination and kind of signals a turning point for the colonial systems that existed. Now, European nations at the end of World War I still had colonies all over Africa. So you look at imagined ideas like this League of Nations, and it's almost something that you think there's no way this is going to work from the very beginning, because from the beginning you have a League of Nations that also own other nations that might be sovereign in their own right, that will certainly have people who are willing and able to lead them. Take a nation like British India, which at the time is still a colony of the British Empire, and has had at this point nationalist movements within itself for hundreds almost of years. So there was never a chance that a country like India's self-determination, which was a goal of this peace at the end of World War I, would be able to actually earn independence, because the British Empire was not going to give it to them. And you see these sort of big movements of self-determination happen right after 1918. In 1919, you have the Samul-Undang, the Korean March 3rd marches, in which the Koreans protest against the Japanese Empire, and it results in the death of thousands of peaceful, nonviolent protesters in Korea. The same thing happens in British India, where nonviolent organizing is met with harsh colonial responses, at times resulting in the death of thousands of soldiers. So the short-lived sort of dream of self-determination and sovereignty for these people who are willing to claim nationhood never really works out, and it kind of shows sort of both the promise and the lack of fulfillment in the end of World War I. Now, the idea that sovereignty, I should say before I move on, and self-determination continue to be core issues in our current worlds, in our current politics, in the current situation. Catalonia is perhaps the best example, or maybe even the Kurdish vote to create a Kurdistan out of Iraq that was took place last year, resulted in almost a complete barricade of Kurdistan, and was not recognized internationally. So we had a massive popular vote. Nearly over 90% of the population voted for Kurdistan to leave Iraq, and it just wasn't internationally recognized or supported. So we're still coming to terms with this idea of self-determination and people claiming their sovereignty. And it continues to be, and will likely continue to be, an issue. So we have these formidable ideas created at the end of World War I that we're still struggling to come to terms with. Now, the other idea I wanted to talk about in the 100 years since the end of World War I is this concept of war to end all wars, and how it seems wars continue on and on. The United States has now been in Afghanistan for 17 years. Now, technically that's not a war, but it is a war because there's soldiers there and people dying and people fighting. So what does this mean, the war to end all wars? Of course it wasn't the war to end all wars. And we have this sort of contradiction that continues through the 20th century of wars that aren't actually internationally recognized wars, just violent conflicts that continue. And they continue all over the world almost unceasingly in the 20th century. And so it becomes a real question of when are people going to step up and demand that these sort of things end? We get into really scary sort of territory in the most recent period, where we have this idea now of humane war. Whereas in World War I, it was sort of old tactics and new technology like all wars, but just people being mowed down by the thousands, fields and fields of dead bodies after failed charges. In the present day, we have this almost sick contradiction. Well, it is a sick contradiction of what's called humane war. So can war be humane? Is it humane if a drone goes and takes out an isolated village? Well, depends on how it's reported, and this is kind of where the journalism and reporting of war always comes in to play. who knows who's actually being killed abroad? We have very little information on this sort of thing, and it's one of the things that it seems that more people could be talking about. Current ongoing conflicts such as Syria that have been going on for years now, with technology that is sort of, just pushed off to the side as people saying, well, this is humane war because it's just isolated effects. But in reality, it's not that much different from what was happening 100 years ago. So rather than being a war to end all wars, World War I was a time, at least the end of World War I, was a time of promise that is yet unfulfilled. The promises are there, the intentions are there, but it doesn't seem that people are willing to back them up or work by them. Now, moving on to less sort of momentous, less challenging periods of what's happening in the world. In India, there was just a couple weeks ago the unveiling of the world's largest statue, standing at nearly 600 feet tall, what is called the Statue of Unity. Vallabhbhai Patel is now towering over Gujarat in India, and has been spoken of as a symbol of Indian nationalism, a symbol of the unity of India. India's history and India's identity also sort of come out of these ideas of self-determination, of sovereignty, and come out of a war as well. It's the end of World War II when the British Empire, mostly for financial reasons, realizes that it has to give up its India colony. There's also a lot of other international changes that are going on, such as the establishment of the United Nations, in which the world is sort of moving towards this period of decolonization. It's not immediate. World War I ends in 1945, and it's not until August of 1947 that India gets its independence. Of course, India is partitioned between Pakistan, East and West. Now, East Pakistan is Bangladesh, and India. Now, India was a part of the British Empire, but the British Empire had various agreements with various parts of India going back hundreds of years. There was no unified, uniform India. And this is where maps kind of do a disservice to us. We see the nicely drawn borders and the colors on the maps, and people think that this is the nation. And there's a nation in this map, and it fits nicely into the borders. And any part that is shaded in this color is part of the nation. And I don't blame people for thinking that, because that's what maps look like. And you see maps on the wall, and you see maps on your phone from a very young age, but these kind of things are not as certain as you might think. And in fact, when India gets its independence, when the partition happens, there's a real question of some of the states in central India, like Hyderabad, that have a massive Muslim population but are not included in the other nation of Pakistan, and the predominantly Muslim nation of Pakistan, if these states are going to be part of India, if they're going to be independent, because they sort of get to make their own decision. They have to be brought along to be part of India. And so Vallabhbhai Patel is credited with being the great unifier, getting these princely states, as they're called, such as Hyderabad, to join India. Now, at the end, we have a much more unified India than was perhaps expected. Even with partition and with the separation of Pakistan, India is able to create almost the entire subcontinent. There's some colonies that stick around, such as Goa, remains a colony of the Portuguese. It remains a Portuguese colony on Indian subcontinent until the 1960s, when India actually militarily invades and retakes Goa. But the rest of India, for the most part, there's other things like Goa, the rest of India actually unifies and actually becomes one state. So now under the BJP, Narendra Modi is saying that Patel is really the unifier of India, and we need to honor him. We need to build a great big statue. And we're talking, this thing is massive. It's twice the size of the Statue of Liberty, and just an absolutely huge statue. A lot of people are kind of shaking their head, scratching their head, wondering why India would spend so much money to build a statue of Patel. And it's pretty clear, this growth of nationalism that seems to be paralleled throughout the world. Remember, India elected Narendra Modi years before the rest of the world sort of made its nationalist turn, and he's been in office for quite a while now, pushing forth this message of kind of one India and a clear nationalist message. In fact, conversations have taken place in which people have challenged this choice and this idea of why India would choose a statue of Patel instead of, say, someone like Gandhi. But Gandhi's message is sort of falling out of style, and the idea that, Gandhi was kind of imagining that India would be this like enlightened anarchist state in which there would be small villages of non-modern farming communities throughout the nation. India has gone quite the opposite direction, in which it is a multi-ethnic state. There's over 10 official languages. Most of the official business is conducted in English. But Patel, Modi, and others are arguing is a better symbol for India than the one that the world seems to recognize India for. Most of the world, the rest of the world, is still, in fact, building statues of Gandhi. And there's been debates recently in Malawi in Africa of whether even building a statue of Gandhi is a good idea because of the controversial views Gandhi had in Africa when he was working with Indians but not Africans. Working towards the rights for Indians. So we are again in a position conflicted between why are these people even building statues when there seems to be better places to put the money. It's still a significant achievement and it's a significant statue to look at, but I certainly question the value of the sort of that we get from a giant statue looking down at the rest of the world. It seems like people have no problem ignoring the Statue of Liberty besides school field trips anyway in the United States. And finally, we are here towards the last segment of What in the World, Hour of History, where I take a look at posts that have happened online, comments, and reviews. And last week, after listening to the Symbol of Hatred episode in which Joey Humnicki and I talked about the Confederate flag, Danny commented about the United States flag as potentially being seen as a symbol of hate elsewhere in the same way that a Confederate flag in northern New York might conjure this just feeling of fear and this old emotions of hatred. And it's absolutely correct. It's a good observation, and it's something that we need to consider in this current state. We are living in a time where nationalism is one of the most important ideas at the center of our discussions. I'm sure many of you have seen the tweets that have been going back and forth between President Donald Trump and President Emmanuel Macron from France in talking about if nationalism is good Macron called nationalists traitors. And, Trump had called himself a self-avowed nationalist, saying that he loved the United States. Nationalism is commonly attributed as one of the main causes of World War I. It's certainly a cause of World War II. And it is something that is unique in its contradictions. There's one of the most cited works in the social sciences is Benedict Anderson's Imagined Communities, in which he talks about the ways that print journalism bring people together, where human groups were never more than a handful of people until you have these other ways of bringing people together around ideas, people who have never seen each other, people who have never really even thought about each other. And that's sort of one of these like miracles of nationalism, is that someone in Philadelphia could be somehow connected to someone they've never seen in a place such as California, very far away, connected somehow by reading the same information. Now, there's some interesting things here as well in the current day, where information is no longer just shared between people in a region or in a nation, but information such as this podcast is listened to people on every single continent. So there's a clear growth outside of this nationalism, and we're looking at the potential of a future in which the nation gets even bigger, where it becomes international or transnational, and where connections are made and people share similar cultural understandings and similar goals with people on the other side of the world. So it does call into question the use of these sort of symbols and identity builders. One might argue, sure, it's a good thing to have pride and be a patriot and support the flag and support the nation. In that way, you are supporting a community. But someone else might argue, why would the community stop at the national border? Things such as oceans, winds, and airplanes simply don't stop at the national border and necessitate international consideration. Now, I am a huge fan of flags, and I have always been. For some reason, seeing the flag blowing in the wind, seeing the colors, the designs, has always drawn my eye. One of my favorite places in the city of Philadelphia is Humphreys Flag Company, where you can go in the old city, Philadelphia. You can go and just look at walls and walls of flags. They have a flag from every nation, non-nation, some naval flags. Flags, of course, have their purpose in other industries such as naval navigation and communication, but we should be aware of the enormous power that these flags have behind them. You need not look further than something like the partition of India and the lowering of the Union Jack, the flag of the United Kingdom of Great Britain, and the raising of two separate flags for Pakistan and India, both with deliberate choices in the colors on the flags. Pakistan opting for the Islamic green with the crescent, moon, and star, but the white as well, symbolizing the land of the pure. India choosing the orange of Hinduism and the green of Islam, connected with a peaceful band of white in the center. So flags are enormously symbolic and important in that sense, but they can also, just like the Confederate flag or even the American flag, be turned into symbols of hate. So it's worth consideration as we're going through these flags and thinking about this sort of thing in history. Recently, the city of Montreal, a city with one of my favorite flags, it has the cross of St. George, just like the English flag, but with symbols of the settling nation. So the fleur-de-lis of France, the thistle of Scotland, and the shamrock of Ireland, the rose of England. Yet it had no representation of the indigenous community, so the city of Montreal decided to add a tree in the center for the people who had already been on the land when the Europeans came. I don't see changes to flags as any problem, and certainly almost every flag, there's been no flag that's lasted through time without any changes. So it is something that can certainly be considered. So thanks for the comment, Danny. It was an insightful comment. And please do consider when we're flying the flags, what sort of message is being sent and why we're looking at this flag and why it's blowing in the wind. I know from my trips to France, sometimes there's nothing quite as beautiful as seeing streets lined with flags, but it is important to consider all of the different perspectives and all of the different eyes, and a true exercise in empathy. What are other eyes seeing in this flag? So thanks for joining us for our first session of What in the World, a brief tour around historically relevant events happening throughout the world. A nice break from interviews, but we will be back with more interviews next week and through the end of the year. Thanks again for subscribing to Hour of History. Be sure to check hourofhistory.com/rex. hourofhistory.com/RECS for a bunch of fantastic suggestions for historical and non-historical literature. That's all for today. Thanks for listening on Hour of History, where it's our world, anytime, any place. Have a good one.
Thanks again for listening. Don't forget to check out our recommendations page at hourofhistory.com/rex. That's hourofhistory.com/RECS. There you'll find links to the books mentioned during the podcast, and if you choose to purchase one, you'll be supporting the podcast in the process. And if you still haven't gotten your fill of the Hour of History, make sure you head over to the Hour of History blog, found at hourofhistory.com/blog, with articles being released fairly often on topics relating to those covered in the podcast as well as others. With that, we conclude this episode and hope to have you back for the next one. Take care, and again, thanks for listening to the Hour of History podcast.